I've always been a massive fan of survival horror games. There's something oddly alluring about being trapped in a spooky location full of horrific creatures while being made to solve overly thought out puzzles to unlock something as simple as the bathroom door.
What are you doing, buddy?
The influence of the survival horror genre runs deep within pop culture, and this influence is no more apparent than in indie horror games.
Gives me conniptions.
After spending what seemed like an eternity one night, browsing Steam for that cheap and nasty hit of Black Tar Heroin, janky, low-budget survival horror is what I meant to say. I came across this little gem, sitting pretty with an overwhelmingly positive user review score of 97%, currently on sale for the cheap price of £2.79 Great British Pounds. Due to the cost of living going up in the UK, this was actually my entire month's wages.
Not enough cash, stranger.
Reading the game's enthusiastic description and looking at those crispy 1440p screenshots, how could I possibly resist? So I decided to pick this bad boy up and give him a whirl, and oh boy, I was not disappointed in the slightest. Nightmare of Decay was released on the 3rd of May 2022 by developers Checkmatey, and it uses the Unity engine, if that wasn't abundantly clear already. As with most survival horror games, I find you get the most out of them if you crank the difficulty up to hard, because it builds character. The game begins in an apartment, with the player watching a news broadcast about missing people, before chowing down on the saddest slice of pizza I think I've ever seen, and heading to bed. Just before we can get all snug, the TV mysteriously turns itself on, turning around to see a horrific figure stood behind us, holding the severed head of a woman. Completely unfazed and blaming it on being overtired, yeah, try that one when you're in court for falling asleep at the wheel, buddy. We can finally head to bed. Only to wake up 6 feet under, emerging from the coffin we seem to have been transported to the grounds of a mansion. We're then introduced to that cat from Sabrina the Teenage Witch, who tells us that the nightmare has claimed yet another victim and that our chances of surviving are slim to none, as most people who are brought here are either killed by monsters or self-terminate to escape. Shortly after, we're introduced to one of the mansion's main residents. Hearing screams and moving to investigate, we're met with this handsome chap at an all-you-can-eat buffet consisting of this poor man's entrails.
It's my favorite!
If the introduction to the first zombie in this game looks familiar, that's because it's very similar, if not identical, to that iconic scene when you encounter the first zombie in the OG Resident Evil. The game doesn't shy away from the fact that it is in essence one big reference, and it wears it like a badge of honour, as it should. Callbacks to survival horror giants like Resident Evil and Silent Hill are a common occurrence throughout this game's fairly short playtime, being around 2.5 hours granted you're not rushing through. Some of these references are a hell of a lot more subtle than others, like the game's overall tone, setting, enemies and gameplay loop. That being said, others are a bit more on the nose, like putting the mimic in the library and a regenerator in the catacombs. The best one by far is when James Sutherland from Silent Hill 2 shows up only to get fucking domed by a cultist with a shotgun.
Aren't you Maria?
Regardless of how odd or out of place they may seem, they only add to this fever dream of an experience. On the topic of paying homage, after showing this zombie what it's like to walk the streets of London at night, we can get access to the mansion. Upon entering the mansion for the first time, I was caught off guard as I was hit with a wave of familiarity, a theme that echoes throughout the mansion portion of this game. It's abundantly clear that the Nightmare Mansion takes a hefty amount of creative liberties from the Spencer Mansion. It's most noticeable in the dining room and kitchen areas, with the dining hall here having a puzzle to solve above the fireplace and the kitchen having a very reminiscent design. I'm just very thankful they didn't include music in the kitchen that makes your ears bleed. Fans of classic survival horror will feel right at home here in the mansion. After wandering around for a little bit and taking in your surroundings, it's not long before we fall into that tried and tested formula of solving puzzles and scouring every inch of the mansion for keys to progress forward. You know the one. It goes like, find the key, unlock the door, get the thing, use it on the thing, create the acid, melt the wall, get the key, open the door, and blow up the mansion. If you've even looked in the direction of a classic survival horror game, you know exactly what I mean. It takes that basic gameplay loop and runs with it, without adding much else, which isn't a criticism since it didn't need to do anything else for it to work. If it isn't broken, don't fix it. It's worth a mention that a lot of the items we'll be hunting for throughout this game also happen to be staple Resident Evil items. We've got cranks, jars of chemicals, bolt cutters, various coins, and most suspiciously, the RPD keys. They didn't even try and hide that one, did they? The puzzles themselves are pretty decent. They're straightforward enough if you pay attention, so no master's degree in brain surgery is required. The only puzzle that managed to stump me was the dumbwaiter one, and that's because I didn't read the hint properly. I must have spent about 5 minutes uninterrupted trying to jam a rotten sack of meat into the dumbwaiter from the wrong floor while fighting the urge to look up the solution online.
Don't you feel silly? Don't you feel stupid?
That is proper IGN review behaviour right there. It's quite the achievement when this game manages to invoke such a strong sense of familiarity, yet at the same time being a completely fresh experience. To top it off, this game nails that old school low poly aesthetic to a T. Honestly, if you were to squint your eyes and turn your head sideways, you could swear you were playing a Resident Evil game on the PS1. As the holy book of survival horror dictates, besides running around and solving puzzles, you're going to be spending a fair amount of time in combat. In between us and escaping the mansion is Nightmare of Decay's main threat, the common house zombie. To be honest, there isn't much to say about these guys, they function exactly how you'd imagine them to. They infest the halls of the mansion and slowly lumber towards you when you're spotted. To make up for them being a relatively small threat, they take a fair amount of handgun bullets to put down, which gives them a good chance to close the gap and attack. You could opt to run round them instead to conserve ammo, which is a good strategy often enough. However, I'm going to class this game's stamina meter as an enemy too, as I spent more time fighting that than anything else in this game. It fucking sucks. It feels like it was put there with a god-given right to piss me off. It only appears when enemies are nearby, which is an interesting design choice to say the least. It's not present when you're zipping round trying to slam coins into the mantelpiece, but as soon as whoever we're playing as so much as gets a whiff of an enemy, they suddenly develop the lung capacity of someone who smokes a pack a day. God forbid you try to run past a few zombies on a near-empty stamina bar.
It took you 4 fucking seconds to piss me off again!
This game's movement in general feels clunky and lethargic, especially when you're trying to run and gun in a confined space while you're being attacked. You could argue that it's trying to capture those old-timey tank controls but with a first-person perspective, but if this were an intentional design choice, I don't think sacrificing gameplay quality for aesthetic purposes is really the best way forward. It's not as noticeable when fighting common enemies, but you really do start to feel the lethargy when fighting bosses. I first noticed this when fighting the game's first boss, the meat golem. He wasn't that much of an issue, but trying to avoid hits while trying to shoot at the same time was the most challenging thing about him. Maybe it's a skill issue though, there's always that. At one point in the game you end up in a library full of cultists. Upon entry, it does this little pan around shot with a similar sound effect to the one used in Resident Evil 4 when you reach the castle for the first time. On one hand, I do like the Resident Evil 4 vibes these guys give off, just ominously standing there chanting away to themselves. On the other hand, they've come packing a Glock, so these guys are just hit scan machines that shred you if you stand out in the open. Regardless, they're a breath of fresh air after spending a large majority of the game up to this point fighting zombies. The crosshair bloom is most definitely the scariest thing in this game. As soon as you dip out of cover, the crosshair blooms, usually resulting in you missing your shot. You've essentially got to stand out there in the open like a proper dickhead to get an accurate shot in. If you get hit, the crosshair also blooms, so your best option is to bum rush them like a fucking maniac while tanking a few hits in the process. I died to these pricks far too many times to admit. It was about 5 times. Just to add another dimension to the gameplay, Nightmare of Decay also includes a shooting range minigame in the same vein as Resident Evil 4. It lets us hone our sharpshooting skills using a pellet gun, which I definitely didn't mistake for the shotgun at any point, while trying to get the high score. The higher the score, the greater the reward. You can get the high score fairly easy with a bit of practice, so you're not spending too much time here away from the meat of the game. If the inclusion of a minigame wasn't enough, there's also an optional side quest to complete which involves making a deal with this forbidden glory hole. Its request is simple, it just wants some head. Female head, of which it wants 3 to even out its predominantly male collection. Throughout the game you'll come across heads without having to sidewind too much. You can't complete the quest too early as the last head is tied to a boss fight towards the end of the game, which I presume is for balance reasons because the items you get for completing this quest are generous to say the least. The main objective of the mansion section is to find a crown to place upon this king bust, revealing an elevator to the basement area. After crafting the acid and collecting the diamond key, we can gain access to one of the upstairs rooms which was previously inaccessible, where we are met with this lovely scene. I'm not gonna lie, that's me approximately 10 seconds after waking up. It's apparent we aren't the only ones who have been dragged into the nightmare. We do come across a few others in our travels, however they're already dead when we find them or on the edge of insanity. Grabbing the magnum and the key off the desk, we can head outside, putting down Fido and pals before entering the cabin where we meet yet another survivor. A sorry looking fellow drinking himself into oblivion, having locked some poor soul outside to be eaten by the aforementioned pack of zombie dogs. What a charming guy. He doesn't stick around for long though. After grabbing the item we need, a shotgun cultist crashes the lock-in to splatter this dude all over the table. It's also at this moment I realised this game had dismemberment physics, which is a very cool touch. What isn't a cool touch is when we leave the cabin, a bunch of cultists start sniping us from afar in a very awkward and janky encounter. At least this time you can hide behind a tree and get some good pot shots in. Finally collecting the crown, we're suddenly trapped in the room with possessed suits of armour. Two of the knights are close range, charging at you to attack. The other two stand back and shoot arrows at you. It's not as hectic as a fight as you may think, as you can easily drop these guys with the magnum, which amounts to an easy win. We can then use the elevator to gain access to the obligatory basement and sewer section. You really don't do much down here apart from wade through water, bonking zombies on the head with a crowbar, a weapon from a more civilized age. It's got a long ass wind up but kills zombies in 2 hits on hard, making it a very useful weapon in terms of conserving ammo. One thing I haven't mentioned so far is how this game handles its ammo economy. There are 3 main weapons in Nightmare of Decay: the pistol, shotgun and magnum. They function as these weapons always have in survival horror games. The more powerful the weapon, the more scarce the ammo. There are also throwables, dynamite and holy water. I'm not explaining what dynamite does, as it's pretty self-explanatory, and holy water acts as an incredibly powerful grenade doing mass amounts of damage. However, they're very rare. Melee weapons are also pretty handy when you're all out. The knife is okay in the beginning, but the crowbar we get later on in the sewers puts in work. Plus the beefy sound it makes when it makes contact with zombies' skulls is bliss. As the game progresses, each encounter gets tougher, meaning spending more resources to survive. At some points I was left completely out of ammo and healing items, hoping there would be some just ahead. Towards the end I always felt like I was scraping by. Luckily I never softlocked myself at any point, to my own surprise. It's also down here we fight the chainsaw psycho, the same one who was hanging around in our living room at the start of the game. He's no Dr. Salvador, but he is annoying as fuck. His favourite attack is the one that stun locks you in place and insta-kills you. How very fucking nice. After a bit of trial and error to work out the fight mechanics, turns out you have to do enough damage for him to expose the weak spot on his back. Then you just whip out the magnum and remove that proper sinister shit-eating grin off his face for good. After that we're on to the final area of the game, the catacombs. The catacombs is my favourite area in Nightmare of Decay, mainly because this is where the barrel skeletons live. And you don't want to mess with these guys, they will fuck you up. The main objective down here is to chase this cultist and secure the plates to open the door to get the other plates to raise the walkway. Yeah, I'm not even making that up. The game spices it up a little bit with giant spiders and a giant spider boss fight. My ammo supply really started to dry up here, so I desperately tried to stick to using the crowbar, only for my ADHD brain to get bored and feed him some buckshot instead to save some time. In the pursuit of one of the plates we meet a mortally wounded man, who warns us that the next room contains a terrifying creature that can't be beaten. This little gauntlet run section had me stuck for a while. There are these running zombies that absolutely demolish you. I ended up using a lot of my best resources to get past them. We then come face to face with the horrific beast the man warned us about. A Monty Python and the Holy Grail reference. It's a good job I had a spare holy hand grenade. Feeling pretty badass about that, I was then instantaneously mogged by a skeleton. Soon enough we're on to the final boss fight. The fight with the Lord of the Nightmare is pretty straightforward, but definitely one of the most challenging. The most annoying thing about him is his incessant need to summon in skeletons and tougher, faster zombies, putting a big focus on crowd control, so explosives come in handy here. Either way, I ended up beating him with a combination of Shadow Gun Kata, Dynamite Kung Fu, and Divine Inspiration. We're then transported back home, seemingly free from the nightmare, or so we think. Nightmare of Decay is a great survival horror experience, capturing the essence of those old school games in a nicely packaged love letter to the genre. Despite the low budget jankiness, you have to remember that this game was made with a box of scraps! and is a perfect example of limitation inspiring creativity. The main selling point of this game is certainly the gameplay and exploration aspect. It's incredibly fun wandering around the mansion looking out for key items and solving puzzles, while managing resources and making a conscious choice whether or not to engage in combat at the risk of being injured or wasting ammo, just as it should be in all great survival horror games. Besides the gameplay, there are fragments of a story being told throughout, mainly in the form of notes left behind by the victims of the nightmare. Yeah, don't worry, you won't. They're okay, but I spent most of my time wondering just what the fuck was going on. That's actually not too far off how I felt playing Resident Evil for the first time, so no criticism there. I managed to squeeze 2.5 hours out of this $2.79 indie horror game, which is amazing, considering you can get less for so much more with some AAA titles. Just to shit on Resident Evil 3 Remake for a couple seconds longer, Nightmare of Decay also comes with a few bonus modes and additional weapons to unlock, which just goes to show how much time and effort was pumped into this game. As a closing statement, I genuinely hope that the devs, and that's presuming there was more than one person who made this game, take any profit from this game and put it all into a sequel with a more fleshed out narrative and gameplay loop. This game isn't perfect by any stretch, but that doesn't stop it from being a worthwhile experience. We need more indie horror games that say fuck it and do it live, making a game with pure admiration and care. The devs clearly wanted to make a game for fans of survival horror, taking feedback and using it to build upon the foundations and improve their game for the better, and honestly, it worked out for them in the best way possible. Playing this game is like a trip down memory lane to a simpler time, being a genuine love letter to the games that defined a genre.